Welcome to the Black Writer Studio, a podcast presented by the Hurston Wright Foundation and hosted by Dr. Khadijah Ali Coleman. The Black Writer Studio is dedicated to showcasing Black writers who are transforming the world today with their literary pen and creating a legacy for the culture. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is a scholar of public policy, radical politics, and social movements. She has written 3 award-winning books, including Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership. This book was a semi-finalist for the National Book Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2020. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is also a recipient of the 2021 Guggenheim Fellowship and the 2021 MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. She is a contributing writer of The New Yorker and is currently a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is the 2022 recipient of the Hurston Wright Foundation's Ella Baker Lifetime Achievement Award that recognizes writers and arts activists for exceptional work that advances social justice. All right, Dr. Taylor, welcome. So I know that with all of the accolades and all of the things, the work that you've been doing in our community, I am sure that no one has asked you this very pressing question as to what is the meaning of your beautiful name?
That's funny. In fact, a few people have asked me that. I did an interview with a magazine, Lux magazine, last year, and this woman, the interview started in 2019 before the pandemic, and she kind of followed me around for a while. And I have this picture that my mother and father had put together that kind of explained the meaning of my name, along with several different iterations of writing it and trying to come up with what it would look like and how it would be spelled. But, you know, basically the short answer is that, you know, my folks were young Black people radicalizing in the late 1960s and 1970s. And, you know, there's, from that point on, we get Black folks with different crazy names because that is the thing that we can control, and, you know, to give our particular imprint on, you know, our people. And my name was a part of that whole transition.
Well, it's beautiful. And, you know, I'm a fellow hyphen holder. So I wanted to open up with that because your name is so beautiful. But I also I really want to jump in with the fact that we know you as this scholar, this historian, but what few people really realize is that your early work in tenant advocacy and on the ground as an activist. And what I'm fascinated by, and I would love to learn more about that transition from being on the front lines as an activist in advocacy around housing and transitioning into your work as a scholar. And what led to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it was certainly my activism and organizing that you know, led me to these big questions that I wanted to answer. And so the main one, you know, I moved to Chicago, one, to work with men who had been sentenced to death after confessing to capital crimes in a scandal that would later erupt, where police were torturing Black men on the south and west sides of Chicago. into confessing to crimes, and then those confessions were used to send them to death row. Mm-hmm. And so in the late 90s, these men began to organize themselves, and I moved from Chicago to New York, and participated in a campaign to try to free them from death row, but also end the death penalty in Illinois. Mm-hmm. And so I came to the city for political reasons, but one of the first things that I recognized upon moving, like literally as I was driving the U-Haul, across Chicago, was how incredibly segregated it was, because we came in coming through Indiana, so through the South Side of Chicago, and it's just like miles and miles and miles of Black people, Black neighborhoods, right. And you literally don't see any white people until you cross through the downtown, the Loop area of Chicago. And so that had always resonated with me. And then, a few years later, when I became centrally involved in activism around housing, and that it was my job. I was employed as what was called a housing advocate, a tenant advocate, meaning I went to court with people to try to circumvent their eviction.
Oh, wow.
My office was located in the north part of the north side of Chicago that was mostly white. And almost all of our clients were coming from the south and west sides of the city. And so I wanted to understand how, most people think about segregation as just, do white people want to live next to you? And, where people choose where they want to live and all this. But Chicago was so profoundly segregated that it couldn't have just been by choice, right. That there had to be other factors involved. And so that question really is a reason why I went to graduate school.
Because you wanted to balance or add to the work, because it seems like that activism hasn't stopped, but now you are really at the forefront of digging beneath the veil of a lot of the talking points that politicians tend to center around. And one of the things that I love the interview that you did with Amy Goodman in 2020, where you were talking about a lot of things that were happening during this reign of Trumpism. And you speak about one of the quotes: the majority of people who suffer from oppression and exploitation in this country and other countries have never had guns to force our agenda onto anyone. We've always had the mass of our movement as that which is the vehicle for social transformation. And so you speak to that this need for people not only to push back, but the importance of organizing. Can you talk a little bit about what you see right now, where we are, as being our best examples of organizing and mobilizing around issues to make change happen? Especially, we talk a lot about George Floyd and these instances that have happened recently, as if racism is new, as if oppression is a new thing. But I really would like to know from your lens and from your vantage point, what have been some movements or some organization that you've seen as being really pivotal and impactful, pushing back a lot of the things that are taking place currently in our society?
Well, there's, my own personal experience. I talked earlier about my involvement in a campaign to end the death penalty in Illinois. And, for me, that was very pivotal. It was very impactful, because this was a true expression of grassroots activism that included not only men who were on death row, and who were very much a part of the organizing, decision-making, leadership of the organizing, but also their mothers and, members of their family. And this was, we had regular meetings that were of kind of seasoned activists, of students, of family members of death row inmates and men on death row themselves, who were all collaborating and working together to build this campaign to end the death penalty in Illinois. And we won. We actually were successful in building a movement to end the death penalty in Illinois in 2000. And several of the men who were tortured into capital crimes were exonerated. Chicago is one of the few cities that actually put forward, after much pressure, years after the campaign that I was involved in, to demand reparations for the men and families of people who had been tortured by Chicago police. The part of that demand was not just monetary, but it was also to have curriculum in schools that talked about Chicago police and their history of racism and torture. And so that would not have happened without the intervention of ordinary people. And so that's a kind of, really big and important example to me. But, some of the organizing I was involved with in Chicago around housing and the housing crisis, there's always a housing crisis,
right?
Earlier iteration of housing crisis in 2006, 2007, right. 2008 and 9. That was where we were trying to stop the eviction of people from either their homes or apartments by involving people in communities, involving people in the neighborhoods. And that was much harder to do because of the kind of, in one case, you have a very specific law that is easy to challenge, and you can either overturn it or not. Right. In this case, it's much more complicated because for many of us, we see housing as a human right, which of course is not recognized in the law in this country. And, housing is a commodity. Housing is to be bought and sold. And if you can't afford that commodity, then you're out of luck. And that is the actual law. So that has been much more complicated. But nonetheless, I think that the efforts of groups that I was involved in and other kinds of activists who continue to mobilize around this issue of housing is to raise this question about why housing should be regarded as a human right. And so I think for me, the overall kind of theme is that in our country today, especially, politics, formal politics, is dominated by millionaires, is dominated by the wealthy and the powerful. If you look at our Congress, almost every senator in the United States is a millionaire. In the House of Representatives, the average wealth is, I think, something like over $900,000. And so you have a Congress that is overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly wealthy, and have no clue about the daily struggles that ordinary people, let alone ordinary Black people, are engaged with on a daily basis, just trying to hold their lives together. And so relying on that body to come up with policies and practices that can actually respond to the needs of ordinary people is really impossible. And so it's activism and organizing on the ground, which raises the issues of regular people. It is what puts these issues to the forefront where they would otherwise be swept under the rug. And I do think that We saw that with the George Floyd protests, that those were protests against the ineffective response to COVID, but also the kind of unchecked racism of American police, and how those two things were working together, even during this period of, a generational catastrophic pandemic. There was still no relief, for the most marginalized and poorest among us. And so the work of activists, I think, is what brought to the fore the issues of racism, and not just interpersonal disagreement or racism as an interpersonal phenomenon, but racism as a concrete factor in American life that African Americans in particular have to contend with on a daily basis. It brought to the fore the issues of inequality and inequity when looking at the horrible ways this country responded to the pandemic. Now, the ability to actually transform those conditions, raises questions about strategy, about tactics, about how we organize ourselves, which continue to be important questions. But we don't even get to those issues if you don't have people on the ground who are raising the real issues, and not the talking points that the people in Congress and formal politics like to dabble in.
Right. And the fact that one of the things that I find so remarkable regarding your journey, regarding your work, is that you're often doing this without the media acknowledging the inroads and the accomplishments and the impact, and knowing that oftentimes this work is happening as if under the cover of the night, because it's so hard for a lot of times to rally support when so few are really knowledgeable of the layers of work that's happening. And so, and I love, there's so many quotes that we pulled with you speaking to the work of you, for example, Martin Luther King, and how you speak disparagingly on how his I Have a Dream speech really has been weaponized and has taken away from who he was as an activist and as a person, to really be used as a capitalist tool. And how, the media kind of aided in the downward popularity of his work. While ironically, the media, his team really brilliantly utilized the media in the early part of his career, only for that to be turned against him later in his career. This is a setup to my question about this relationship to the media and activist work. I know a lot of your writings are very popular or brought up in the media, but who are the people that you write for, and who are the people that you write for, and what are the messages that you want people to take away from your work as both a brilliant author and an activist?
That's such a great question. So I think I write for two audiences. One is I definitely write as a movement participant. I'm no longer in the situation I was in maybe 10 years ago, where, I went to meetings 8 days a week, and I, was up from the beginning of the day to the very end of the day, making phone calls, going to meetings about meetings, and then in other meetings about how that meeting went.
Right.
So I can't do that anymore because, I have a full-time job that, requires a lot of work and travel, and I have a 6-year-old. But I still, I think that participation in social movements, doesn't look like one thing.
Right.
So I think everyone has to find the thing that they're going to do. And maybe that's a few different things, and then, do that. And so for me, I write, and that is, a role that I've accepted that's what I can do
Right.
now. And so in writing, I am writing both as a movement participant, as someone who wants to contribute to the politics, the development, the strategy, and the tactics of the various work that we're involved in to change either a particular campaign or ultimately, many of us are involved in this work because we think that there has to be a deeper, more fundamental transformation of the United States. That Martin Luther King described it as a radical revolution in values in the U.S. And so so I write in my book, the two books, first books that I wrote, from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation and How We Get Free, Black Feminism in the Combahee River Collective. Those are in many ways movement books. They're written for the movement. They're written for people who are in sympathetic towards the movement, in solidarity with the movement, even if they haven't found their own particular way into that. So that's one audience. And then there's another audience, because I'm also a regular writer for the New Yorker magazine. And that is a kind of much broader liberal audience, which I think of as people who are sympathetic to protesters, to demonstrators, but not yet convinced that about what the nature of the problem is, who still may harbor illusions in how those problems are changed, meaning that if we elect this or that person, then they will come in and change these things for us. Mm-hmm. And who are maybe in a period of transition, of questioning, of trying to find a way to understand what the problem is, trying to utilize or gather some language to be able to explain it, to understand it, and are on their way to having a much more structural, deeper analysis and critique of the way that our society is organized. I'm very much a strong believer in, not just discarding people who don't think like I do or who don't see things the way that I do. I think that every radical person began as someone who did have those kinds of illusions that, if you think about the trajectory of the civil rights movement, in the 1950s and the early 1960s, the idea was, if we just show the rest of the country that look how racist these people are, look how racist these situations are, then that will, create sympathy, change hearts and minds, and we'll get rid of Jim Crow and Black people will be equal. Right. And by 1965, 66, the people who thought that were revolutionaries, who no longer believed that change was possible through the ballot box in the United States, and began to look towards third world revolutions, began to look towards the politics of socialism and communism, because they no longer believed that the American system as it was constituted was capable of responding to the needs of Black people. Right. And so no one had to tell them that, no one had to argue that, oh, well, things won't change and things are very static. They experienced that themselves, especially many of them who went to the, Democratic National Convention in 1964, where Fannie Lou Hamer gave her tired of being sick and tired speech, and looked at the Democratic Party catering to the Dixiecrats and ignoring the multiracial contingent that had organized itself as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and left that situation no longer believing that they could appeal to the moral conscience of the Democratic Party. Right. And so all radicals began where many of those civil rights activists began, of
Right.
harboring illusions that our system as it currently exists can create change.
Right.
But then you see the pandemic response, then you see the response to the murder of George Floyd, and you see a year after the largest protest in American history, we still can't get voting rights protected.
Right.
We can't get the most watered down, toothless police reform passed, let alone actual substantive police reform passed. We can't get anything.
Right.
And so then when that happens, in the face of the largest protest in American history, you begin to ask questions about, why is change so hard to achieve? Why is it so hard to come by?
Right.
And so I'm writing for those people as well who are asking that question. So those are two audiences, the tried and true who are in the trenches, but also those who are questioning what the direction of this country and who desperately want something different and might not know or understand why things are the way they are or how to get there, but want things to be different.
You you explain that so clearly, and you extend so much grace to that latter group. Would you say that at some point you may have been part of that latter group, that you held fast to some type of hope, where now your strategy is radically different than what you probably led with?
You know, I've been doing a lot of work on Angela Davis recently, and you know, I had the privilege of interviewing Angela Davis, I think maybe a year ago, and I asked her a question about growing up in Birmingham, and you know, I was like, you know, nobody's born a radical, and eventually something happens that, you know, turns someone into a radical. So what was the story with you? And you know, she was like, kidding, but well, I may have been born this way. And so and what she meant is that, you know, her parents were fellow travelers of the Communist Party. She grew up among Black members of the Communist Party, Black people from New York who had moved to Birmingham for the express purpose of organizing and fighting against Jim Crow. And so there may have been a very brief time in which she was naive about the possibilities that, you know, American democracy could just change things on its own. And so for me, I wasn't what some people refer to as red diaper baby. That's what they used to talk about, the children of members of the Communist Party.
Right.
But I was a black diaper baby.
Right.
Meaning that, you know, my father was a Black power radical, an organizer with an organization called the Black Workers Congress. My mother grew up in Nashville in the 1950s and 1960s, and certainly witnessed and participated in some of the civil rights activism in that city. So the period in which I may have harbored any illusions in the power of American democracy was exceedingly small and brief.
Right,
and so
right.
I think by the time you know, I was 14, I was already involved in a socialist organization. I remember being 9 and my teacher had to call my mother for a parent conference because they had asked us to write a little paragraph about Abraham Lincoln, and I had written something to the effect that Abraham Lincoln was a white racist dog who like stood by while slavery was happening. Yes,
Oh, no.
like extra conversation I had overheard my father with someone else. And I just remember my mom, because my folks had split up by this point, my mom calling my dad, and I couldn't hear him, but all I could hear was her saying, she's 9 years old. So yeah, my liberal illusions were very short and quickly dispatched.
That is so hilarious. So that leads me to my last and final question. When we think of, so much of your experiences sound so familiar to me because I'm a Khadijah Ali Coleman. So you can imagine my parents, very similar vein of upbringing. And so, I think about when you mention your 6-year-old and this transition now where you are in your life, where you are definitely more in that scholar realm, where you're leaving, you're creating now the documents to leave behind. Tell me about what kind of world you would like for us to be in existence or have in existence when your 6-year-old is now our age or it becomes our age.
I will say that I'm afraid. It is frightening. The climate catastrophe is real. We are watching it unfold in slow motion, and the millionaires and billionaires who run this country, many of whom are old and don't care because they're old and are so short-sighted that they refuse to acknowledge. They're short-sighted and greedy. Yeah. They refuse to acknowledge the depth of crisis and the need for radical action to change course. So I'm afraid about the future of not just our society, but of the world if we continue on this course. And so to me, it means that the need for radical politics has never been more important. And by radical politics, I mean that we have to look beneath the surface to understand the extent to what is wrong in this country and its dynamics that exist across the world. That, it's not just a question of if we tinker with this one thing, if we tinker with that one thing, if we elect this one person, if we elect this one, administration, that in and of itself is enough. There is a fundamental flaw with the fact that our society glorifies the wealthy and the powerful, the 1%, and degrades life for the absolute rest of this society. There is something completely wrong and backward about that. And it's not something you can just educate people out of. Right. That if they just understood what they were doing, then somehow Jeff Bezos would divorce himself from the $200 billion he controls. No, And so that's why struggle is actually necessary, because those who have wealth, power, and authority will not just walk away from wealth, power, and authority. Mass movement has to force the issue to actually transform our society. And so I think that that's a struggle that unfortunately we are bequeathing to the next generation. And so I am, I don't want to end on this crazy dystopian note, but I do think that we have to grasp the degree of crisis that this country is enveloped in. The United States life expectancy has gone in reverse. Yep. And it is not just COVID. Yep. It's drug abuse, it's drug addiction, it's alcohol, and it's suicide. And why is that? It's because we live in a society that degrades the life experience of the vast majority of people. For Black people, for Latinx people, it's much worse. But for white people, they're leading the way in what are called deaths by despair. And so that just means there's generalized crisis for everyone. And so the point is that we have to struggle and fight and not sugarcoat things and not just find the silver lining, but we need to ring the alarm bell, and then get active and get organized. We also don't have to sit back and be passive observers of what is happening. But we have to fight for a different kind of world to leave our kids and to leave the next generation. It's not just going to happen because we're outraged about what's happening. It's something that we actually have to fight for.
Well, I personally find your honesty refreshing. I always enjoy listening to your interviews, and to be able to ask you these questions directly has definitely been a highlight of my week. And, as we close out, I would say, as a representative of the Hurston Wright Foundation, that I think you definitely embody the spirit of Ella Baker being one of our heroines, and who really lived her life speaking truth to power. And I think that you are just you were such a perfect pick for our board. I don't get to vote, but I would have voted. I'm really excited that you are being honored by our organization. I'm just really excited for the work that you do and that you continue to do. And your 6-year-old, I think that you answered my question in terms of hope, and your hope is that he continues to fight, and hopefully your 6-year-old will be at the forefront, like their mama, doing it for the people. Thank you so much for spending time with me on the Black Writers Studio. I appreciate you so deeply.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, yes.